In this module, we're going to talk about how to lie. We're going to talk about how to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. This is a 2D art class, but we want to create the illusion of depth so that things look like they go back in space. As part of creating the illusion of depth and using color to do so, we are going to talk about atmospheric perspective. And the way in which we do that requires, by art law, that I show you a picture of mountains. Atmospheric perspective is not the linear perspective that you're going to be learning in your drawing classes. What we're talking about here is simply the effect on color and clarity that happens when you look through air at a distance. So there's a lot of schmutz in the air, and the result is that between you and objects far in the distance, that schmutz will change the appearance of those faraway objects. All three properties of color are going to change, as will the clarity. The clarity is relatively straightforward. You kind of get it. Things have fuzzier edges when they're far away and look more crisp when they're close. With the atmospheric perspective affecting color, we want to start with value because a lot of people actually make a mistake with that. What is happening is not that it is getting lighter as it moves towards the horizon line, or at least not universally. What is happening is that we are losing value contrast, and the objects take on the value of the horizon line itself. So for example, at night, instead of the colors getting lighter as they recede into space, they would get darker as they recede into space. So when we're thinking about value as part of atmospheric perspective, it's losing contrast. Temperature, it tends to get cooler the further away it is. So warm colors advance to the eye, cool colors recede. When we have an object move back in space, it will take on a cooler appearance. One thing to remember, though, is that it's unlikely that it's going to get so cool that it would fall out of hue category. In other words, if I chucked a red apple into this landscape, it is not going to turn purple once it gets far enough away from me, because the third property of color is changing too. We are going to lose intensity at least as fast as we change temperature, and possibly faster. So the apple will look gray before it turns purple. I'll lose all the color. High intensity colors come forward, low intensity colors drop back. And that's the key metric by which we are going to be evaluating the project that we do this week. What we want is for the intensity of the color to make the biggest difference on our appearance of atmospheric perspective. One thing I should note is that artists will cheat, they'll exaggerate. So in this case, in Watteau's landscape, we actually do have things fall out of hue category. We start off with dark darks and light lights, and they become the color of the horizon. We start off with warms, look at all the yellows and these greens, and it gets cooler as we go back. And in his case, he is letting it turn blue, all the way to blue, so that we get an exaggerated sense of atmospheric perspective. But you can see that he is also affecting the intensity so that it gets grayer, softer, less contrast of value as we go back in space. We're going to see that contemporary artists use the same techniques as well. Part of the way we get the tube on the playscape to come forward is that it has a strong value contrast. We have a deep shadow and a really strong highlight. The temperature is much warmer on that tube than it is in some of the cooler temperatures as we blend into the graffiti on the wall. And the intensity is much richer. We have a really strong red compared to the grayed out reds as we fade into the background. One of the other things that can happen is that when we're thinking about how color affects our perception of depth, we want to account for what's going on in abstract or non-objective work as well. And here we will often use a term coined by this guy, Hans Hofmann, that is called push-pull. When we're talking about push-pull, we, in some areas, are talking about the same kinds of atmospheric perspective conditions. High intensity warm colors advance to the eye, low intensity cool colors recede. So this pushes forward, this pulls back. But part of what is happening is that this occurs not only in and out in our perception of depth, but it also works to create visual tension across the surface. The way in which the yellow at the top seems to compress that darker blue between it and the red is an example of push-pull as well. We seem to have those two warm colors pushing down to compress and concentrate that blue. We can also see the way in which he's using that same yellow to create visual tension across the surface, almost like he's creating brackets. We've got the yellow repeated here, but we can definitely see the way he's used that yellow in mixture as well. We can recognize that pigment even when he's mixed it with the blues and the greens, and the way that it creates, therefore, these sort of brackets. We anchor the corner down here, we anchor the corner up here. We've got this hard stop here that keeps us from drifting in, looking at the yellow, and then drifting out. We're more likely to engage with the entirety of the picture plane because of how he's pushing and pulling our perception across the picture plane and in and out in terms of depth with how the color affects our perception.